allowing them to shift into a habitat where they're not going to have predation as much. So I do have this question that since we're seeing now, post introduction of wolves, we're showing reduced calving rates in terms of calves born, and also reduced survivorship of the calves that are born, and it's a dramatically lower survivorship. Do you think you would claim that living in the woodlands is maladaptive? So is this like, is this anti-adaptive? Or is this shifts reflecting some kind of adaptive advantage for these guys? What do you think? Certainly we're seeing the reproductive output as decreasing. So what do you think? Is this a maladaptive behavior? Or is this an adaptive behavior to shift into living in the woodlands now that wolves are around? Yeah.
It could be adaptive just because less reproduction, their saving energy is not reproducing as much, so there's less growing intake. Present, there's less targets for them to go after.
Mm-hmm.
Because the offspring are usually the weaklings that after, so there's less chance for the wolves to take it. They do get one, it's a greater, but
Yeah.
with more adults and less offspring.
Other thoughts? I think I'm sort of, this could be protect. Adaptive, maladaptive? What do you think? More resources. Okay, yeah. Yeah, if you is sort of an interesting thing too. If you look at species composition in these meadows, they have changed fairly dramatically now that there's so much less herbivory. There's this sort of steady devouring by the deer, by the elk, and as a result you have a shift in the sort of plant diversity that's present. Other thoughts on this? Does anybody think it is maladaptive? I mean, maybe we need to define these terms. In contrast to maladaptive, I'm gonna define adaptive behavior, and I deleted like 5 or 6 slides at the beginning of this lecture because it's not really in your book anymore. They sort of changed around these chapters that kind of focuses on how do we define adaptive behavior. But let's define this. An adaptive behavior would be the best available whoops. I don't know. That's a decent definition. So I'm saying if an adaptive behavior would be the best available behavior in terms of reproductive success within a given population. I'm saying best available because different populations may have different behavioral repertoires present within them, and we're trying to identify which one of these in this population is the best. And that is going to depend on the habitat, or depend on the environmental conditions in which you're living. So a maladaptive behavior I don't know if I'm going to be able to write up a good definition for this, but this would be a let's just call it not the best. My handwriting is really deteriorating. I don't know what's going on. So a maladaptive behavior would be a case where we're seeing suboptimal, substantially suboptimal behaviors here. The thing that about this, I think that has to be recognized is that we've had a change in the habitat. We've had a change in the environment that these animals are living in. So before the wolves, there are no wolves, and therefore you have a certain sort of settings where if they're making a decision between feeding in the meadows versus feeding in the woodlands, they do not have to account for the predation from the wolves. Post-wolf reintroduction, now wolves are a factor, and so their environment has changed. And so they, in this case, they're shifting their behavior, and probably that reflects a shift in what is the most adaptive behavior. The most adaptive behavior is very likely to be in those woodlands. Even though they're getting less calories, they're also better protected. And presumably if they went out in the meadows, then I don't know if their calving rates would be down, but certainly their losses in terms of calves per year would probably be worse living in the meadows than they are currently from the woodlands. That would be the expectation anyway. I think it'd be cool if there are some packs that are in the, or not packs, if there are still some herds of elk that are still in the meadows versus some that are still in the woodlands, and you can compare their yields. I think that would be an interesting thing. You would expect better survivorship of calves or better total number of calves produced from the woodlands than in the meadows with wolves present if this is in fact an adaptive behavior. Does that make sense? Yeah, no? Questions? I'm seeing yeses amongst those responding. Okay. So the idea here is that we're looking at, we're trying to look at optimal behavior, and a lot of times I think these sort of optimality theories directly involve, we have to consider more than the classic optimal foraging theory. We can't just consider caloric yield per time. We need to think about predation. We need to think about other factors too. Chris and I were talking about, potentially mating opportunities might be greater under certain circumstances. It's not really directly related to this one, but those kinds of factors could potentially also come into play if you're talking about foraging. How will these different foraging approaches affect your mating opportunities? Directly your mating opportunities in terms of encountering females or encountering males. So we can't really just focus on calories per time. All right. So we've seen two circumstances in the last two examples where we have animals that are shifting their foraging behaviors, so we've got multiple foraging behaviors present within a population. So in the case of the dugongs, we have cropping versus excavation, as sort of two alternative tactics that you can pursue when you're foraging. In terms of the elk, we have basically two habitat preferences, which will result in two different foraging habits. We have living in the meadows with all the lush food versus living in the woodlands where the food is more sparse. And so in both of those cases, you have alternative, and I'm going to define these as alternative foraging tactics, where you have sort of differences in style, differences in approach to how you're going to go about foraging that are driven by these different environmental differences. So any one individual could opt into either of those behaviors depending on the conditions that they find themselves in. So a dugong can excavate or it can crop, and one individual can switch between those two things depending on the circumstances and what's most advantageous to it or what cues it gets that inform it about what to do. Similarly, these elk, presumably, can go to the meadows or they can go to the woodlands, and they will shift their behavior depending on environment. So if the landscape of fear is such that it's appropriate to live in the woodlands, they will shift into the woodlands. There's another way in which you can have alternative styles present within a population, and that's what's called an alternative strategy. So if you have alternative foraging strategies, and if we're being really specific about our terminology, strategies refers to having the alternates present within a population need to be genetically based, such that one individual cannot switch between them depending on their conditions and circumstances. So this term tactics versus strategies, in certain areas of behavior anyway, this gets really, really specific about how we apply those terms. And in this circumstance, tactics refers to something where somebody has one conditional strategy and then they can alternate between tactics as they wish, depending on circumstances. Strategies, this is determined by your genes. And I think these are really interesting because oftentimes we think about animals making some decisions and behaviors being kind of plastic and they can apply learning to allow these things to work. But in strategies, that doesn't seem to be the case. When you have alternative foraging strategies in a population, you just have differences in how animals will behave, and they're sort of set up by their genes. So I'll give you a couple examples of alternative foraging strategies. The first one, this has always been one of my favorites, are rovers versus sitters in Drosophila larvae. So these are fruit fly larvae, Drosophila. Same fruit flies you might have sorted once in high school or something when you're doing a genetics experiment. And if you compare across them, you may find that there are some larvae that tend to be what we call rovers, where if you place them, this is sort of the experiment, if you start them off in these two little areas on this plate, so this is sort of a plate of fruit fly food for these larvae, and you're placing some of them here and some of them here, what you'll end up seeing with rovers is they very quickly will kind of disperse around their entire surroundings. They tend to be pretty active and they tend to have high movement rates. Sitters, on the other hand, if you stick them in here on this food patch, they just kind of sit there. And that's why they're called sitters. So they just sit there foraging away. They kind of grind away at the food, and they're consuming at that point. So they have low movement rates. The cool thing about this is that this difference in behavior in these alternative foraging strategies are driven by differences in what's called the foraging. And the foraging is, I can't remember if we specifically talked about it or not, but this is a gene that is also found in bees, for example, and this is something that tends to be change its expression when individuals shift from being nurses to being foragers. It seems to be kind of an activity gene in a way. But these guys have heritable differences in their foraging. Some of them get the sitter allele, some of them get the forager allele, the rover allele, and if they're rovers, they move around a lot. If they're sitters, they do not. So we have a genetic difference that's driving the differences in the behavior. So what do you think benefits might be to being a rover? Or benefits to being a sitter? Why would, if we've got these differences in behavior, presumably there's differences in performance then. There's benefits to being one or costs to being one. What do you think might be a benefit of being a rover? Okay. I'm sorry. I saw you both almost simultaneously. So, well, what about? Okay, so that makes sense then, right? I mean, any other ideas about benefits to being a rover? What would be the cost to being a rover, do you think? Yeah. But for some reason I started abbreviating energy NRG, and I just can't seem to stop. There's got to be some kind of energy cost, right? I mean, so you're spending all your time roving about, so that means you're moving more, which means you're burning more calories in order to be moving about. What about sitters? What would be a benefit of being a sitter? It might actually be kind of up here, right? So sitters, it's sort of the flip side of the cost there that we said. So sitters will tend to use less energy when they're foraging. So we have, but you know what the cost to being a sitter potentially is that you may, if food is getting bad in your particular area, you may not be so good about getting out of that area to go find a better food source. So you know we have these sort of two alternative strategies that are driven by genetic differences, and they seem to have sort of different benefits to them, and therefore you might expect under different conditions. Sometimes maybe it's better to be a rover. Sometimes it's better to be a sitter. Does that make sense? So if food is really good in your area, probably better to be a sitter. If food is getting bad and competition's getting high, maybe it's better to become a rover. And the cool thing is that if you look at a lot of these studies are done in cultures, but if you look at cultures that have different compositions of sitters versus rovers, and therefore different levels of competition, different amounts of individuals roaming about, different amounts of individuals sitting, you see that there's something called, we call it frequency-dependent selection, which is what's being shown here. So this graph it always takes me a second to get my head wrapped around it, but what they're showing here is the frequency of sitters in the population. So 0 would be 100% rovers and 0% sitters. 50 would be 50% sitters, 50% rovers. 75, this would be 75% sitters and therefore 25% rovers. And then over here would be 100% sitters within your population. And so then what they do on this graph is they're plotting what is the fitness. So by fitness they mean basically if you are a sitter, how many babies are you likely to leave versus if you're a rover. So the sitters are plotted in red and the rovers are plotted in, what is that, purple? They're pretty close, yeah. So what do you see going on here? So let's actually do the exercise that's down on the bottom. Let's assume that there's equal numbers of sitters and rovers. Which of those two phenotypes would be favored by selection? Why? So 0.5 would be equal numbers of each, right? In that circumstance, the fitness of rovers would be 0.8, whereas the fitness of sitters would be 0.7-ish. Maybe not quite that high, or not quite that low. So rovers should have an advantage over sitters when they're equal 50-50, according to this graph. So that means if rovers have a fitness advantage, they should leave more offspring in the next generation. So if they do, then the frequency of rovers should go up, which means the frequency of sitters, which is what's plotted down here, should go down. So let's say we shift from 0.5, let's go all the way down, just to make it easy, down to 0.25. So now we're here, where we have very few sitters and very many rovers, because rovers previously had an advantage. Now who's got the best fitness? Sitters, right? So now there's tons of rovers around. So everybody's just like traveling all over the place. They seem very dissatisfied with where they are. They're always trying to find the next batch of food. If you're a sitter under these conditions, you're just kind of chewing away at this batch of food and you're perfectly content and happy while everybody else is wasting all this energy roving about. You're doing really well. And so at this point now, the sitters do better and the rovers do more poorly. So that means in the next generation, the population should shift to favor sitters, so that our frequency of sitters should shift back up. And so we're probably going to be in kind of this equilibrium, with this sort of yo-yo, where every time sitters become more common, they lose their fitness because too many individuals in the population are just sitting down and chewing away at the food, and it becomes really advantageous to go roving. But then as sitters become less common and everybody starts roving, then it becomes advantageous to be a sitter. And so we get this kind of equilibrium thing going on where they'll sort of oscillate around this point. They usually won't be just sort of sticking at this point all the time, but they'll oscillate around this point in terms of population percentage. So you'll get this kind of dynamic equilibrium happening. So we call this frequency-dependent selection, where the fitness benefit of having one particular strategy depends on its frequency. So the more frequent sitters are, the less good it is to be a sitter. The more frequent rovers are, the less good it is to be a rover. Does that make sense? I think it's really, really interesting because normally what you expect to see happen when you've got multiple traits that have a genetic basis in a population, usually one of them is going to result in higher fitness than the others. But in this circumstance, well, let me finish that thought. So if they usually are going to have higher fitness than the others, then those that have the highest fitness should basically take over, and all the other variations should just drop out of the population. They should be outcompeted. But in this circumstance, you've got two phenotypes that can kind of coexist, because whenever one becomes more common, it becomes less fit. because of this interaction that's happening between the sitters and the rovers. Here's another example of an alternative foraging. Well, I'm not going to tell you what it is, but here it is. So these are African cichlids, and they have left and right-jawed genetic variants. And so what I mean by this, these are a particular weird kind of cichlid. They're almost like they function kind of like a lamprey. So these are not lampreys, these are cichlids. But these particular cichlids are parasitic in that they will find other fish, larger fish, and they'll kind of swim up to the side of them and just bite onto them and just start chewing away. And this is how they make their living. So they're, these kind of gross looking, these gross kinds of fish. But they come in left-jawed and right-jawed varieties, and that is determined by their genes. So if you're left-jawed, your jaw kind of points to the left, and that means you have to approach from the other host fish, the host fish's right side, in order to get on them. Whereas if you're right-jawed, you always approach from the left side of the host fish. And what you can see happen if you go and measure the frequency of left-jawed versus right-jawed individuals, this is frequency of left-jawed individuals. That's kind of like the previous graph over time. So this is 1980. There were a few more left-jawed individuals, but then it kind of shifted down, so there were more right-jawed individuals and fewer left. And then it shifted back up, and then went back down, and went back up. And so you see them kind of oscillating right around this 50% mark in this particular case. And presumably what is happening here is that as left-jawed individuals become more common, it becomes less good to be a left-jawed individual. So you'll have more competition for this side of the fish if there's a bunch of left-jawed individuals. Maybe the fish get really paranoid about and are sort of watching more alertly on their right side for left-jawed fish to come in if left-jawed individuals become more common. And so there seems to be this kind of stabilizing effect where the more left-jawed there are, the less fit they are, and therefore the more fit the right-jawed individuals are. And they're sort of oscillating around this. So is this alternative foraging tactics or alternative foraging strategies, do you think? Based on that description. Why strategies? Because it's genetic based, yeah. So these are alternative foraging strategies. This is another really nice example of these things. Alternative foraging tactics would be a situation where you can make a decision, and individuals could pursue either variant. I would imagine, probably hard to shift between being a left-jawed versus right-jawed fish. We will see this concept of alternative tactics versus alternative strategies applied in other contexts later on. So here we're talking about alternative foraging tactics, alternative foraging strategies. We will talk also later on in the semester about alternative reproductive tactics or alternative reproductive strategies, where we're seeing variation in the types of approaches individuals use in reproduction. So a good classic example would be a situation where you have, like in bluegill, for example, you'll have dominant individuals, which have the dominant males have a certain kind of behavior suite that they apply. They sort of secure territories, and they defend the territories, and they solicit matings from females. And then you have female mimic males that just kind of look like females, and they sort of sneak up to females that are hanging out with the dominant males and try to mate with them. And then you even have these little sneaker males, which are really small, and they literally just kind of zoom in and try to mate with the female and zoom back out before the dominant individual can get them. So we have different types of behavioral suites depending on which kind of male that you're dealing with here. Some of these examples will be genetically based, in which case they'd be alternative strategies. Some of these are more tactics where one individual could pursue alternative strategies depending on its environment. Any questions about that stuff? I'm seeing none. All right.